The word that should not exist on a mountain pass soaked in blood. A hero died with his face turned toward the enemy. But the greater horror was not how Roland died. It was who he may have been. Because buried inside one harmless word was a secret so dark that even the church may have helped hide it. France, 778 A.D. High in the Pyrenees, the air had turned thin enough to sting the lungs, and the stone walls of the pass threw every scream back upon the dying. Charlemagne's rear guard was collapsing beneath a sudden storm of steel as Basque fighters poured from the slopes, like shadows born from the mountain itself. Horses kicked and shrieked in panic. Supply wagons burned where they had overturned. Men slipped in blood and mud, then vanished beneath blades falling too fast to count. At the center of the slaughter stood Roland, the most admired warrior in the Frankish world, gripping the sword that legend would one day polish into myth. He was young, fearless, and already too proud for survival. Even as the trap closed around him, he refused to summon help. To blow the horn would mean admitting weakness. To Roland, death was preferable. When he finally raised the ivory elephant to his lips, the sound tore through the pass like a wound opening in the sky. It was a cry of desperation, but also of defiance, a final act of pride from a man who understood too late that courage could not always save the doomed. The horn reached Charlemagne miles away, but not in time. By the moment the emperor understood what had happened, Roland was already falling among the dead, his body broken, his sword hidden beneath him so no enemy hand could claim it. That image would survive for centuries. A loyal knight, a glorious sacrifice, a perfect hero. But history has a habit of polishing bones until no one notices what lies underneath. The story of Roland became one of medieval Europe's most treasured legends. In monasteries, courts, and castles, poets recited his last stand as proof of what honor should look like. Yet the old poem returned again and again to one detail with strange insistence. Roland was always called Charlemagne's nephew. Not once, not casually, but over and over, with the kind of repetition that feels less like description and more like instruction. He was the nephew, always the nephew. The word was repeated so often that it stopped sounding natural. It began to sound guarded, like a door being bolted from the inside. For centuries, no one questioned it. Why would they? A nephew was innocent enough, a respectable bond between emperor and hero. But medieval texts are rarely as simple as they pretend to be. Scholars who dug into older literary traditions, scattered fragments, and the oral stories beneath the surviving poem began to notice something unsettling. In certain medieval conventions, kinship terms did not always mean what they appeared to mean. Sometimes a safer word was used to veil a more dangerous truth. Sometimes nephew could hide a son whose birth could never be openly named. A son born not from lawful marriage, nor from some passing affair, but from a union so forbidden that the memory of it had to be buried inside poetry itself. And that is where the silence around Roland begins to rot. Because if he was not Charlemagne's nephew, then someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make the world believe he was. If he was truly the emperor's son, then one terrible question rises from the dust of the court and refuses to lie back down. Who was the mother? The answer waiting in the oldest whispers is the kind that ruins crowns, poisons churches, and turns golden history black. They did not hide Roland because he was unimportant. They hid him because the truth of his birth may have exposed the darkest secret in Charlemagne's bloodline. And once that possibility enters the room, nothing in the imperial palace looks innocent anymore. Asterisk the emperor the world was taught to worship. History remembers Charlemagne as the father of Europe, the crowned defender of Christianity. But power without limits rarely leaves innocence behind. And inside the golden palace of Aachen, whispers began to grow that the emperor's greatness hid something darker. when the story of Roland begins to unravel. It leads inevitably back to the man whose shadow dominated all of Europe. Charlemagne was not merely a king. He was a force that reshaped the continent itself. Born in 742, as the son of Pepin the Short, he inherited a kingdom already rising from the ruins of the old Roman world. But what he built went far beyond inheritance. Through relentless wars, careful alliances, and an ambition that seemed to stretch as far as the horizon, Charlemagne carved an empire that reached from the Pyrenees Mountains to the cold forests of Germany. His victories came one after another, each campaign expanding his authority while leaving behind burned towns, shattered tribes, and conquered peoples who had little choice but to accept the new order imposed upon them. To his admirers, he was the champion of civilization. To his enemies, he was something far closer to a storm that never stopped moving. By the year 800, the transformation was complete. On Christmas Day, inside the ancient city of Rome, Pope Leo III placed an imperial crown upon Charlemagne's head, declaring him Emperor of the Romans. The moment was presented as a rebirth of order in a chaotic world. Churches rang their bells. Priests proclaimed that God himself had chosen this warrior king to defend Christendom. For the first time in centuries, Western Europe had an emperor again. From that day forward, Charlemagne's reputation became something almost untouchable. The chronicles praised his wisdom. The poets celebrated his victories. The church itself built his image into the foundations of European identity. In the centuries that followed, school children would learn his name as if it belonged beside legends like Alexander the Great. Yet beneath the monument of his legacy stood a man of unsettling contradictions. Charlemagne promoted learning and invited scholars from across Europe to gather at his court, launching what historians would later call the Carolingian Renaissance. Yet the emperor himself struggled to write, practicing letters late in life, but never fully mastering the skill. He championed Christian morality, but the private records of his household tell a story of appetites that ignored many of the very laws he claimed to defend. 5 wives passed through his life, each marriage tied to politics, alliance, or convenience. When marriages ended, concubines replaced them. Children were born in numbers so large that even the official sources struggled to keep track. For a medieval king, such behavior was not shocking. Kings were expected to produce heirs and demonstrate strength through their bloodline. What mattered was power, and Charlemagne possessed more of it than any man alive. But absolute power creates a dangerous silence around those who hold it. No noble would dare challenge the emperor, whose armies controlled their lands. No priest would easily accuse the ruler who defended the church with sword and fire. In Charlemagne's empire, there existed no higher authority capable of questioning his personal life. The court praised him, the church needed him, and the people feared him. In such a world, rumors did not vanish. They simply learned to whisper instead of shout. And inside the emperor's palace at Aachen, among marble halls and torchlit corridors, where scholars debated philosophy and diplomats negotiated treaties, those whispers began to circle around a subject that few dared discuss openly. It was not about wars or politics or religion. It was about the emperor's own family. Because the deeper historians look into the private life of Charlemagne, the more one strange pattern begins to emerge, a pattern involving the women closest to him, the daughters he refused to let leave his court, and the sister whose name almost disappeared from history entirely. Once that pattern appears, the legend of Europe's greatest emperor begins to look less like a shining monument and more like a carefully guarded secret. The sister who disappeared from history hook-line, in a court that recorded everything, gifts, laws, battles, even the price of bread, one woman almost vanished from the record entirely. Charlemagne's own sister. And when history hides someone that carefully, It usually means the truth about them was too dangerous to write down. The imperial court of Charlemagne was one of the most documented courts in early medieval Europe. Officials recorded diplomatic gifts from distant kingdoms. Scribes preserved legal decrees with obsessive detail. And scholars at the emperor's palace wrote accounts of daily life that would survive for centuries. Almost nothing escaped the notice of the Carolingian record keepers. Yet in this ocean of information, one figure appears only as a faint shadow: Charlemagne's sister. Her name appears in different forms depending on the surviving texts, sometimes Bisala, sometimes Gillen. But regardless of the spelling, the pattern is the same. She enters the historical record briefly and then almost disappears, leaving behind a silence that historians have struggled to explain. In a dynasty where family members were tools of diplomacy and symbols of royal legitimacy, such absence is not normal. It is deliberate. Royal women in the Frankish world were rarely invisible. Sisters of kings were married into powerful families to secure alliances or strengthen political networks across Europe. Their marriages were recorded because those alliances mattered. Their children were documented because dynasties depended on them. But in Charlemagne's case, something strange occurred. His sister's life is barely described at all. There are no detailed records of her marriage, no clear account of where she lived after Charlemagne became king. No trace of the alliances that a woman of her rank should have created. Instead, the chronicles simply fall quiet. As if a curtain had been drawn across a room the historians were not meant to enter, yet history rarely hides perfectly. When official documents fall silent, other traditions sometimes continue speaking in quieter ways. The medieval epic traditions that circulated through Europe, the songs and stories recited by poets long before they were written down, preserved fragments of a different narrative. These stories were not bound by the political caution of royal scribes. They traveled from court to court, carried by memory, slowly changing with each generation, but often preserving truths that official records avoided. Within these older traditions, a disturbing rumor appears again and again. The rumor describes a relationship between Charlemagne and his own sister that crossed a boundary the church considered among the most severe sins imaginable. According to these scattered traditions, the emperor and his sister shared a secret bond that went far beyond what any brother and sister should ever share. It was not a brief scandal whispered in private chambers. It was a relationship that produced a child, a son. But such a child could never exist openly in the court of the man who had been crowned defender of Christendom. The church that had raised Charlemagne to imperial glory could never allow its greatest champion to be remembered for a sin condemned by every moral law it taught. So the story had to be reshaped. The child could not be called the emperor's son. He had to be something else. This is where the legend of Roland returns with a new and unsettling meaning. In the epic poems that immortalized his heroism, Roland was always introduced with one careful description: the nephew of Charlemagne. The word was repeated again and again, almost as if the poets wanted to make absolutely certain that their audience heard it clearly. But if the hidden traditions were true, that word was not an explanation. It was a disguise. Roland, the greatest hero of the Frankish world, may have carried a title designed to conceal his real origin. And if that origin was what the whispers suggest, then the legend of Europe's most celebrated knight was built on a truth so dangerous that it had to be buried inside poetry itself. Asterisk. The daughters who could never leave Charlemagne's palace was the brightest court in Europe, filled with scholars, gold, and imperial power. But for his daughters, those shining halls may have been something else entirely, because none of them were ever allowed to marry, and none of them were allowed to leave. Inside the imperial palace at Aachen, life was designed to display the power of the greatest ruler in the Western world. Marble halls reflected the light of hundreds of torches. Scholars from distant lands debated philosophy beneath vaulted ceilings. Diplomats from Baghdad, Byzantium, and Italy walked through the palace gates carrying gifts meant to secure the emperor's favor. To outsiders, the court looked like the center of a reborn civilization, proof that Europe had risen from the ruins of Rome. Yet hidden inside this magnificent court was a strange rule that baffled even Charlemagne's closest observers. The emperor's daughters, despite their noble birth and political value, were never allowed to marry in the Frankish world. Royal daughters were powerful pieces in the game of politics. A marriage between kingdoms could prevent wars, create alliances, and strengthen dynasties across entire regions. Kings carefully arranged these marriages to build influence beyond their borders. Charlemagne himself understood this perfectly well. He used marriage alliances for his sons and his noble followers whenever it served his empire. Yet when it came to his daughters, the emperor refused every proposal. Not once during his long reign did he allow any of them to leave the palace to become the wife of a prince or king. The decision confused diplomats and frustrated nobles who hoped to join their bloodlines with the most powerful family in Europe. Charlemagne's biographer, Einhard, attempted to explain the emperor's behavior with a sentence that historians have debated for centuries. According to Einhard, Charlemagne loved his daughters so deeply that he could not bear to be separated from them. At first glance, the explanation sounds touching, even admirable. A father devoted to his children, beyond what politics demanded. But the deeper one studies the details surrounding their lives at court, the more unsettling the explanation begins to feel. Love can protect, but it can also control. And the daughters of Charlemagne lived under a control so complete that it shaped every part of their existence. The young women were educated, which was unusual for their time. They learned reading, music, and religious study while remaining constant companions to their father. When Charlemagne traveled, they traveled beside him. When he hosted feasts, they sat at his table. When foreign ambassadors arrived at Aachen, the daughters appeared beside the emperor like jewels in a royal display. To visitors, they looked privileged and admired. But behind that elegance stood a reality that could not be ignored. The women had no path to independent lives. Marriage was impossible. Leaving the palace was unthinkable. Their identities existed entirely within the shadow of their father's authority. Then Einhard added a quiet detail that changed the entire story. Despite never marrying, several of Charlemagne's daughters bore children. The biographer used a careful Latin word to describe the situation: scandala, scandals. He did not explain what those scandals were or how they began. He simply recorded that the emperor chose to pretend they did not exist. The children were raised at court, openly acknowledged yet strangely unexplained. In a palace where every servant and soldier lived under the emperor's watchful eye, the existence of these children raised questions that no one dared ask aloud. If the daughters could not leave the court, and if every man who approached them lived under Charlemagne's authority, then who truly controlled the relationships that produced those children? And why would the most powerful ruler in Europe allow such scandals to happen inside his own palace unless he wanted them to happen in the first place? The churches that bought silence across Charlemagne's empire, churches and monasteries, rose like forests of stone. Historians long called it devotion, proof of a king's faith. But some scholars now wonder if those sacred walls were also something else. The price of keeping a terrible secret buried by the height of his reign, Charlemagne had become far more than a warrior king. He was the political and spiritual pillar of Western Christendom, a ruler whose authority stretched across lands that had once belonged to the Roman Empire itself. His armies conquered kingdoms, but his influence reached even deeper through the church. Monasteries were built in newly conquered territories. Churches appeared in villages that had never before heard the sound of Latin prayers. Bishops owed their positions to imperial favor, and abbots governed vast estates granted directly by the emperor. On the surface, it looked like a perfect alliance between crown and altar, a partnership between sword and scripture that reshaped medieval Europe. Yet when historians began examining the scale of Charlemagne's religious patronage, the numbers became difficult to ignore. The emperor did not merely support the church. He flooded it with wealth. Lands seized in conquest were gifted to monasteries. Treasure taken from defeated enemies was distributed among bishops and abbots. Entire religious communities appeared across the empire under Charlemagne's direct sponsorship. His generosity exceeded the expectations of royal piety by such an enormous margin that even contemporary writers noticed it. To them, it looked like the devotion of a ruler determined to defend Christianity at all costs. But medieval institutions rarely functioned on faith alone. Power and forgiveness were currencies traded just as carefully as gold. And the church possessed something even emperors sometimes needed: absolution. During Charlemagne's lifetime, the church maintained detailed penitential handbooks that catalogued sins and prescribed punishments for them. These manuals listed offenses ranging from minor moral failures to crimes so severe that they required years of fasting, pilgrimage, or public humiliation to cleanse a soul. Among the most severe entries were the violations of sacred family boundaries, acts considered so dangerous to the moral order that they threatened not only individuals, but entire bloodlines. The penalties were harsh, yet history shows that powerful men rarely suffered those punishments publicly. Instead, a quieter system emerged, one built on negotiation between spiritual authority and political necessity. Within that system, a ruler who committed a grave sin might compensate the church through acts of extraordinary generosity. Endowments to monasteries, construction of cathedrals, and vast donations of land could serve as acts of penance that restored harmony without exposing scandal to the public. The church preserved its moral authority, and the ruler preserved his throne. Both sides benefited from silence. When Charlemagne's enormous religious donations are viewed through this lens, the picture becomes more complicated. The emperor's generosity begins to look less like pure devotion and more like something closer to payment and ongoing exchange between a man who possessed immense power and an institution that controlled spiritual judgment. This interpretation is impossible to prove with absolute certainty. No surviving document openly states that Charlemagne purchased silence for a crime hidden within his household. Medieval rulers were careful to avoid writing down confessions that could destroy their legacies. Yet the pattern remains difficult to ignore. The emperor built churches across his empire with a determination that bordered on obsession. The church, in turn, elevated his reputation to near-saintly status and ensured that no official record questioned the purity of his family life. If the whispers about Roland and Charlemagne's sister contained even a fragment of truth, then those monasteries may represent more than monuments of faith. They may stand as silent witnesses to a bargain struck centuries ago, a bargain in which sacred stone became the cover placed over one of the darkest secrets in medieval history. Asterisk. The emperor who refused to lie down. When Charlemagne died in 814, the most powerful man in Europe was not buried like other kings. Instead, something far stranger happened. For nearly 2 centuries, the emperor was said to remain seated on a throne in the darkness beneath his chapel, as if death itself had not been permitted to end his rule. On January 28, 814 A.D., the reign that had reshaped Europe finally ended. Charlemagne, the emperor who had ruled for nearly half a century, died inside his palace at Aachen at the age of 71. His empire stretched across vast territories, his name already wrapped in legend, and the church he had supported so generously now prepared to honor him with burial worthy of a Christian emperor. Official accounts describe a solemn ceremony within the palace chapel, the Sacred Heart of Charlemagne's capital. Yet alongside this official narrative, another tradition emerged almost immediately, one far stranger than anything normally associated with medieval burials. According to multiple medieval sources, Charlemagne was not laid down in a coffin like other rulers. Instead, his body was placed in a seated position upon a marble throne deep beneath the chapel itself. The image described by later chroniclers is unsettling. The emperor, dressed in his full imperial garments, crown resting upon his head, scepter in his hand, and an open gospel book placed across his lap. Rather than resting in death, he appeared to be sitting in judgment, like a ruler who expected to rise again at any moment, to resume command of the empire he had built. The chamber around him was sealed, leaving the emperor alone in darkness beneath the sacred floor of his own chapel. Medieval writers struggled to explain why such a burial had taken place. Some claimed it symbolized Charlemagne's eternal authority over the empire he had created. Others believed it reflected the emperor's own wishes, a final display of power meant to blur the line between life and death. Whatever the reason, the decision transformed his tomb into something more like a throne room preserved beneath the earth. Nearly 2 centuries later, curiosity overcame fear. In the year 1000, Emperor Otto III, a young ruler obsessed with reviving the glory of Charlemagne's empire, ordered the sealed chamber opened. The witnesses who entered that vault recorded a scene that sounded less like archaeology and more like a dream pulled from the depths of medieval imagination. Inside the chamber, illuminated by torchlight, Charlemagne still sat upon the throne. His robes had deteriorated with time, but the shape of the emperor remained recognizable. The crown rested on his skull. The scepter still lay in his hand. The gospel remained open upon his lap, its pages stiff with age. According to the accounts, Otto knelt before the remains of the emperor whose legend he admired so deeply, as if greeting a ruler who had never truly left the throne. The sight must have been haunting. A king who once commanded armies across Europe, now reduced to silent bones seated in darkness. Yet the symbolism of that strange burial lingers even today. Charlemagne's life had been built on power without limits, a reign so vast that few dared question the man behind it. His achievements shaped Europe for centuries, but the shadows surrounding his family and his private life remind us that history rarely presents its heroes without careful editing. Legends are carved from stone, but secrets survive in the cracks between those stones. And somewhere within those cracks lies the uncomfortable possibility that the greatest emperor of medieval Europe left behind more than an empire. He left behind a story that power, faith, and silence worked together to bury. A story that historians are only now beginning to uncover.